Siblings find answers where nightmares circle and terror plays. The surveyor makes a deal with something beyond the trees. A cashier waits on the edge for more of the strange and scary. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. At first, Eddie thought his dad's pristine candy apple red 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air was a thunderstorm. But then his waking ears found the throaty grumbles of exhaust pipes and engine rods working together. Both Eddie and Ellie were surprised to hear the car running in the garage. The sun was barely up. The morning light was bashful between the curtains and blinds. Both kids staggered out to the garage with messy hair, weak legs, and bad breath. They hadn't even gone to the bathroom yet. It didn't matter, though. They needed to see that their dad was upright, and whether he was okay. Last night, Eddie had passed out on the couch in the living room. It was one of the only clean places in the house where he could actually rest. Ellie had carved out the spare bedroom to stay in. He was a little jealous about it, but she'd earned her place. He ran away from his father, the weirdness and the abuse, while she'd stayed behind in all this chaos. She was like Ripley from Aliens, willing to confront whatever she needed to in order to survive. She put in the work to know this man, so it figured that she'd be more comfortable here. Eddie had known him well enough when they were all much younger, and his comfort there matched the stained, scratchy couch perfectly. The car had an old rattle to it, like a skeleton that had forgotten how to move. Their dad had been passed out for God knows how long. They themselves had gone to bed without remembering what time it was exactly. After the puddles and strangeness, sleep was a welcome distraction for both of them, but especially so for Eddie. Both found themselves simultaneously approaching the garage, where their father was standing at the trunk of the car. The garage door was curled open. Walls of boxes were towered everywhere. Miscellaneous trinkets were jutting out from each cardboard edge, as if trying to escape.
What are you doing, Dad?
Ellie asked, rubbing her eyes.
I got something to show you guys. It needs to be done now. We're going to Hidden Oaks.
Their father said hastily, as if he couldn't allow the slightest bit of hesitation to his words. He was wearing the same clothes he had on yesterday, the ones they'd brought to the hospital for him. There were sweat stains that were already turning his white shirt yellow.
Why so early? Is it that important? Can't we at least wake up a little bit first?
Ellie asked. Her short, pale frame with long brown hair rested easily against the doorway, like she could sleep right where she stood. She was wearing a red flannel with torn-up jeans.
No, we can't. I'm already late, and I think she's getting free. I need to get there to do the rites, and it's time you kids knew where you're from,
he said, walking to the car. He was carrying a large brown leather satchel in his right hand. It was awkwardly jammed full of items, including the lantern and the weird book.
Where we are from?
She looked at Eddie, whose mouth was agape. She'd thought he'd have more to say with so much honesty occupying the air for once, but he just stood there, staring.
Would you mind driving, son?
Their father said, holding up a single key attached to a Camp Snoopy keychain. Wait, what? You want me to drive? I've never seen this car move before in my life, Eddie said, staring down at the shaking vehicle. He slowly took his hands out of his pockets. He was wearing black cargo shorts with zippers hidden between their folds. Atop that was a gray polo with a little Ralph Lauren logo tucked into his chest.
Yeah, I sort of kept it to myself, but time is short, and I need to include you in these things. By lunchtime, you driving my car will be the least strange thing you've witnessed.
Their dad narrowed his eyes to Ellie. She looked shocked by this sudden change in her father's surly disposition.
You can drive back, honey. I'll make it fair.
Oh, it's okay. I'm just a little surprised is all. Eddie here is Mr. Automotive Fancy Jaguar guy. Don't care either way.
You gonna say something, son?
Eddie just pressed his brown hair slowly backwards with his hands and walked backwards, then forwards. Of course I want to drive it. I'm just surprised. Their father wandered into the back seat of the car and sighed.
You haven't seen anything yet,
he whispered. The drive to Hidden Oaks Park took a bit longer than usual. Not because Eddie wasn't used to the car's 1950s maneuverability, but because their father had them circle around the park 5 times. The moment they pulled out of the driveway, Ellie asked the question that had been lingering on Eddie's mind since it was spoken. She felt like this was the safest moment she could do it.
Who is she?
Their father shifted uncomfortably in the back seat and let out one more sigh. It was long, exhausted, and overflowing with years of secrets and frustrations. They had never heard him make that sound before.
I don't honestly know. Nobody does, even in our family. She's just there in the woods, contained below it. Our family, your family. We're not like other people.
Their father stopped and looked out the window at passing homes, looking quiet and peaceful.
Fuck, I've always wanted to be normal.
Eddie couldn't restrain himself any longer. The unusual behavior from their father had paralyzed his animosity toward him, but he couldn't let it go any further. What the hell is happening, Dad? I don't get it. What's with all the openness about weirdness and secrecy? Even for you, this is fucked.
You've had them, the visions. You've had them all, both of you.
Their father interrupted. They were still circling the blocks around the park. The white morning light of summer was getting bolder.
What? What are you talking about, Dad?
She was calmer than her brother. She knew she couldn't stir any aggression with her father, or she'd risk this moment of lucid honesty.
It's not a question, it's a statement. I know you've had them for years. It's part of our bloodline. We're attached to her. We have to keep her here, or where I'm about to show you. It's been in the family for a century or so. Ed, just the other day, you nearly ran this stop sign. I know you were someplace else. It's okay. It's one of our connections to the rights.
You didn't really answer my question about her, Dad. Who is she? What is she?
Their father laughed.
You think I know? Of all the things your wonderful grandfather told me in that diner years ago, this was one detail he omitted. He told me about our role, keeping the core forces happy, how the government would help us. Over time and many visits, he showed me how to do the ritual, how to see through her illusions. God, I wish he'd lived long enough to show you. He was so much better at all this. But since I knocked on death's door, well, it's up to me. Sorry this is such a crash course, and I'm sorry, but you're not going to have normal lives. Stop!
Eddie slammed on the brakes. He was turning into a small parking lot that bordered the forest with the pond. They'd completed their 5 laps.
Back up and park down the street, doesn't matter where. When you go to do the rights, you always give some distance.
Eddie breathed shallowly and rolled his eyes. This is just such fucking bullshit.
You're absolutely right.
Why do you give distance to the forest?
Ellie jumped in, trying to change the subject.
Hang on, honey. Son, you're right. It is absolute, pure, unfettered shit, and it all sounds made up. But just bear with me, and once you get into the forest, you'll understand.
Their father yelled. He wanted to reach out and hit his son in the back of the head like he used to, but instead clenched his fists together. They locked up for a second as he had a heart palpitation. He had to live long enough to show them what to do.
You need to give some space, because if she puts you in an illusion, you need time to figure it out. The larger the illusion, the weaker it is, so it's important to remember this variance.
Their father sighed and shook his head.
Remember, I didn't ask for any of this. It was the hand I was dealt, but it was never the one I wanted to play.
Eddie parked the car down the road just past the church. They walked past the tennis courts, the small round hill outside the forest, and to the edge of the trees. Their father stopped and looked at his children for just a second.
I really didn't think you'd believe or listen to me to get this far.
I don't think we know what to believe, but I don't remember you ever talking like this before.
Yeah, honesty is effective, Dad, Eddie said without looking at him. Their father shook his head for a moment, then walked past them to the woods.
Then I wish I'd been honest long ago.
Inside the greenery, time seemed to slow down for the family. Their father was leading them down a small, twisted path that bordered a small pond with a marshy island in its middle. There were some neon pin flags along the way.
How the hell did these get in here? Don't the agents know not to go messing around in here or let anyone else in?
The father said, ripping them out of the ground. They walked a few yards ahead, ducking beneath branches and avoiding roots in the path. Eddie looked back at the flags his father had flung behind them. They had silently returned to points along the dirt, as though they had never been removed in the first place.
Just keep walking, son. This whole forest is weird. Don't worry about what's behind, but what's ahead.
It took them just a few minutes to reach the water's edge from the leafy bank. They had only wandered about 200 feet into the forest, but it felt like they'd walked about a mile. The silence of the trees was alarming. Both Eddie and Ellie expected to hear bugs, birds, and the sounds of cars buzzing by as they traveled, but sound was absent. In fact, they couldn't remember the last noise they'd heard. This panicked them.
We cross here.
What?
How deep is the water? We don't even have boots.
His father got to one knee and pulled a bright red piece of chalk out of his satchel. He coughed and appeared to draw 2 lines on the ground pointed in the direction of the island. He smirked and slowly crossed the empty air beyond, as though he was part phantom walking on nothing. His shoes clung to something solid but unseen. In just a few bounds, he was over the ring of water and onto the other side. He was winded by it, but smiled back at his children with a sly grin. "What the fuck is that about? Did that really just happen?" Eddie said, backing away from the water. Ellie laughed and jabbed her brother in the elbow as she approached the wonder with a smile.
Look!
She said with a bound, hopping across like she was atop concrete. She tripped slightly when she got to the island. Her father grabbed her arm gently and pulled her to her feet. He pulled her close and whispered just for a second. He knew she was strong enough to hear the truth.
Containment is the only priority.
Eddie was having his reservations about crossing. He was pouring sweat. His body was trembling from the variety of weirdness all around him. Eventually, after a few seconds, he followed them across the unseen floor. As he stared down through nothing, while standing on something, he fell forward into the reedy bank. His father quickly grabbed and stabilized him. Eddie could not remember the last time his father had been so gentle with him.
Believe it or not, son, I don't want you to fall.
There was not much room to walk around on the island. It was small, thick with grasses and stunk of scum. There were still no sounds. The silence seemed to be sitting on the trees above their heads, like the sky was watching them, as if nothing dared to move. Ellie and Eddie stood aside as their father rifled through the weeds until he reached 2 rows of large, curled branches. They were parallel to one another and rising out of the earth in loops, then back into the ground. Instead of just sun-worn bark, there were strange etchings along each strand of wood. There were lines, circles, letters, and unintelligible pictures. When Eddie focused on them with his eyes, which were in constant disbelief of his father's actions and the forest around him, he could hear someone talking to him from afar. They were whispers, almost songs from some lost language. Eddie found himself spellbound by them. A clap on his shoulder from his father's hand jolted him back to reality. His dad tightened his grip a little bit in a loving gesture. Eddie realized that this was not the hand that had beat him so long ago. It was withered, had very little strength, and was simply tired. His father looked at him and nodded solemnly.
Do your very best not to scream.
He put his hand on the branches. There was a groan and rumble beneath the ground, as though the matter was uncertain of its place beneath their feet. The undergrowth began to expand outwards and spread, like a rib cage being opened for surgery. "Holy shit," Eddie said, backpedaling. The motion stopped abruptly, as if it had heard Eddie and become bashful.
"It's okay, old friend. It's just my son."
He patted one of the shapes affectionately. The quake continued in a slow drawl. Time changed around them. Plants grew and disappeared. The sky went from light to dark. Around them, buildings rose and fell like they were living inside a tape on fast forward. Both Eddie and Ellie shook on their feet. Their father grabbed each of them by the arm and leaned their weight into him. It was difficult in his weakened state, but necessary. The first time to the pit was always hard. He knew he needed to support them. The ribs inside the earth completely parted, leaving a round gash with a set of stone stairs leading down. Eddie and Ellie were nearly standing in the water. They couldn't say anything, much less focus on what had just happened.
"This is our stop,"
their father said, heading into the abyss. Stepping down into the dark felt like stepping into a different world. The earth continued its rocky root and dirt-flaking groan long after the opening had stopped moving. They were in an odd sort of cave, a tunnel spiraling unevenly down into the dark. Eddie looked up and around. They should be underwater, according to the swamp they'd just somehow crossed. He found himself pondering whether this was how it felt to lose one's mind. The fact that he was not alone in these experiences failed to bring him any consolation. He couldn't judge how far they had descended when they reached a fairly plain, round chamber. To Eddie, it felt something like being inside a bizarro world igloo, complete with a bit of chill from being underground. He thought he saw some light bouncing on what served as the small cavern's ceiling. It was fleeting, the way light might play off the water's surface at a museum's aquarium exhibit. But a focused look at the stone above revealed no further glimmers.
How is this place not flooded?
Ellie asked, thinking along the same lines. Their father, short of breath again, sat down on a rocky outcropping and cleared his throat before answering.
"In a way it is. Here, this part'll be easier with you two here."
He pulled what looked like a somewhat large mason jar from his pack. The top was not tapered at all, so the lid seemed almost oversized. He struggled attempting to open it, so Eddie grabbed the jar and unscrewed the lid. "What's in here? A rolled-up cloth?" His father nodded in return, gesturing that they should take it out and unfold it. As they did so, the cloth revealed its vaguely hexagonal shape, with small metal grommets at its corners. All but one corner, anyway. Eddie handed back the jar and finished unfurling the awkward sheet. Ellie helped her brother keep the cloth up off the dirty floor of the chamber, though it was plain that such care had not always been taken. Between the dim, indirect light and its accumulated dirt and stains, it was hard to say whether the cloth had originally been gray, tan, or any color at all. Her father shook the rest of the jar's contents out into his hand. They looked like old, rusted barn nails, each bent into a crude hook at the head.
"Which is the corner with no hole in it?"
Ellie already had that corner in her hand and she held it out. Her father wasn't looking. Instead, he was bent over, circling the edge of the rocky chamber and squinting as if searching for a lost contact lens.
"Bring that corner over here."
He had apparently found what he was looking for. There was nothing there as far as either sibling could see, just a small dent near the chamber floor, as if long ago someone had begun digging a small tunnel there and immediately given up. He handed out the rusty hook nails to his children, 2 apiece, and took the last one across to the wall of stone and dirt opposite where he'd just been.
"Get 'em as high as you can reach if you don't want this to take forever,"
he said while stabbing and twisting his nail into the grotto wall above his head. He lifted one corner of the cloth and hung it on the makeshift hook. Ellie started to follow their father's example without a word. Eddie couldn't help but let the theater and film training in him notice some glaring symbolism at work. Even in the space of this small chamber, even when explicitly bringing them all together, his father had managed to literally divide them, to put up a wall, however flimsy, using his old ceremonial junk. The thought made him smirk and shake his head while he twisted in one of the nails. By the time he'd hung up the last corner, more of the metaphor had run through his head. How of course it was up to him and his sister to make up for their father's shortcomings. How a rusted square peg hooking through a tarnished round hole perfectly described every interaction he'd ever had with the old man, suddenly frail and possibly dying, and therefore beyond well-earned criticism. How the work of raising anything up had apparently always been beneath him. With the cloth hung up and with the grunt of a man pushing his unfit body to bend, the empty jar was set near what might have generously been called an alcove, directly under the one unattached corner of the drooping cloth. The upside-down parachute of a shape complete with one end hanging down looked as if it could collect rainwater, if the whole thing weren't in a dirty, underground cave. But to Eddie and Ellie's astonishment, that's exactly what began to happen. The cloth slowly but steadily became sopping wet, dripping water into the jar below. Water from where, nobody could say. The air didn't even feel damp. In a matter of minutes, the jar was nearly full.
Look!
Ellie exclaimed, watching the cloth dry itself from the tacked-up edges downward, as the last of the water drained into the jar, somehow never splashing or missing a drop.
Yeah, it's dry. You can fold and roll it back up now if you want.
The old man was focused on the jar of water. He reached his hand forward, then hesitated. Turning to Eddie, he gestured in a counterclockwise circle.
We came around the park this way, right?
The question hit Eddie with no rhyme, reason, or context, but after a short moment, he nodded in confirmation. It was the only way that made sense to circle the park.
Okay. This doesn't need to be 5 times or anything. You just need to get it swirling good, get a little whirlpool going.
Eddie and Ellie watched as their father stirred the water with his fingers, circling around and around until, just as he said, a small whirlpool was spinning in the center of the jar. Quickly but gingerly, he pushed the jar into the small dent in the cave wall, stood up with a grunt, and stepped back. Eddie and Ellie stepped away too. The whirlpool had grown and the water was swirling faster and faster. Soon the jar could no longer contain the liquid, but instead of splashing up over the mouth and onto the cavern floor, the escaping water became a thick mist. Steam swirled out, stretching the vortex of moisture up from the jar and out into the chamber. The snaking spiral of whirling fog seemed to look right at their father's face. It almost appeared to nod or even bow, before spinning its way to face Eddie, and then Ellie in turn, all while its thin tail remained anchored in the jar. The living cyclone appeared to slowly bow again, then without warning, its finely balanced energy turned and surged all at once toward the alcove. The chamber was filled with a thick cloud. Only the sounds of rushing water, splashing, gushing, washing away at stone provided any clue of what was happening. Just as distance and depth had become mysteries, none of the family could say how much time had passed in this haze. But before such thoughts could even occur to them, the dense cloud dissipated, and the air quickly returned to its former, dry disposition. The jar sat, empty, right where it had been, except its barely noticeable alcove had become an unmistakable, person-sized opening leading out of the round chamber, and down deeper into the pit.
Take the jar,
Eddie's father said to him,
and hold it below the nails.
Eddie looked at Ellie, who gave a subtle shrug while trying to roll up the cloth she had been folding. He picked up the jar and held it under the nail nearest him.
Over there,
Ellie said, nodding toward the nail their father had driven into the far wall. It was being driven back out, slowly but smoothly. It fell to the ground and a few drops of water squeezed from the hole after it. Eddie noticed the next nail towards him begin to move. This time, he got the jar underneath in time to catch it with a satisfying plink. He glanced around and collected the remaining rusted, hooked nails in turn as they were ejected, finally picking up the first one that had fallen and adding it to the jar. For a short while, nobody said anything.
Come on then, back it up. That's it for the easy ones,
Her father said, gesturing to Ellie to stuff the cloth she'd been rolling back into its jar. Their father pulled 2 flashlights out of his satchel and handed one of them to Eddie, keeping the other one for himself. They switched them on. Single file, they stepped through the new opening and into a narrow passageway, their father taking the lead. He had to go slowly, and there were portions that were difficult for him to squeeze himself through. Eddie and Ellie did not have as much trouble. As they continued through the tight inlet, they had to stop at more frequent intervals as their father paused to catch his breath. He was having more difficulty pressing himself onward through the tapering dirt corridor. One particular stop seemed to drag on, and as they waited for the old man, his breathing began to hitch and come to them in sputtered wheezes. The light that played across his face showed them how pale and weak he was. He was sweating, though the air in this current part of the cave was cool. Ellie turned back to face her brother.
I don't know if he can take much more of this.
Eddie looked at her. The concern on both his face and hers was obvious to each of them. Eddie thought for a moment before saying, "Dad, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. Let's go home. You can rest and we can come back when you're ready." Their father tried hard to catch his breath and said between hitched wheezes,
"There's no time. We're already late. The way opens up ahead. This is the last tight portion. I'll be okay. I have to be."
He took in his best attempt at a deep breath and as forcefully as he could pushed it out through pursed lips. Then in a burst of effort neither Ellie nor Eddie would have expected, he heaved himself forward through the passage. They heard a grunt and several stumbled footsteps. In a second, when they caught up to him, they saw that he was right. The narrow passage had ended. They now found themselves on a stone floor approximately 4 feet wide. The walls of the cavern rose up perpendicular to them on their right. And on their left, the path fell precipitously down into an abyss, the bottom of which was some untold depth far below, blanketed in utter blackness. From what they could see by the light of the flashlight, their path wound on in a slight arc to the left and out of sight.
"Containment is the only priority,"
came the breathless voice of their father, who was bent over at the waist with his hands on his knees.
Dad, really, I'm worried about you.
The way is easier from here. It's all down now. There's going to be a wider path. It'll be okay. I just have to watch closely. The barriers are any harder to see.
He's not going to stop, Ellie. Come on, Dad, just go slow. Rest if you need to. Their father stood up and started walking slowly along the path.
The next one is here soon. Can you feel the wind? We're close.
He had already stopped to take another break. Each inhale was a sharp wheeze. As soon as he had mentioned the breeze, Eddie and Ellie felt it too. A hot, dry breath seemed to come toward them from further down the path. It also seemed to gust up occasionally from the edge of the abyss. Their father had taken the satchel off his shoulder and handed it back to Ellie. They stood watching him as he raised the lantern in his left hand and took a few steps forward.
The direction is wrong. It's usually cool and comes from above here. I think it might be a trick.
As he said this, he opened the door on the side of the lantern and produced a small metal object from his pocket. They knew exactly what it was as they heard the characteristic snick of a Zippo lighter's lid being flung open. "Dad," Eddie said as he stepped beside Ellie and reached a hand toward their father, who was now several yards down the path in front of them. "Dad!" Eddie shouted this time, his voice echoing down into the pit. He spun the wheel on the lighter and a small flame licked to life while simultaneously a reddish-yellow flash flew across the path in front of him. Just for a second, the sudden light danced across the cavern like a flashlight beam glinting off the surface of a mirror. Their father staggered and feverishly tried to light the lantern, cursing under his breath as he did so. "Dad!
Dad!
Dad, we used the lantern!"
We used up the wick, Dad.
What?
He turned to face his children, with a blank yet shocked look in his eyes. The lantern hung limply at his side. He lost his balance and weakly staggered backward a few steps, farther down the path toward where the glinting light had just shone. The look on his face turned from shock to rage. The look they had known so well growing up, the face of the monster as Eddie had so often thought of it. Then in their father's eyes, the children turned small. Small like he had been when he found out he had a monster living on his own shoulders. With this, the rage in his eyes subsided and was replaced with a tired look of utter defeat. He dropped the lantern at his feet.
It's not your fault.
What?
What's not our fault, Dad?
Before he had a chance to respond, the flame on the Zippo sputtered out. The air in the cave around them seemed to suck back into the void, and in a moment the flame reappeared on the wick of the Zippo. But it did not stay there. Suddenly the air around their father became a roaring burst of flame which whipped around and engulfed him, carrying him over the edge of the precipice and down into the pit. The blazing ball of fire that was their father plummeted down for what seemed like hundreds of feet, lighting up the cliff face as it fell. Then it arched over into the middle of the chasm, casting its glow onto the distant floor. They caught a fleeting glimpse of something at the bottom of the pit. It appeared to be a tangled mass of giant iron chains. They were able to see the heap of chains move in a way that looked like whatever was restrained beneath them was taking in a great inhalation. Then the light flared and shot straight up to the ceiling of this vast chamber. As the burning light struck the top of the cavern, a loud, thunderous crash echoed throughout. And then it was gone. I knew this day would be significant. It was the logical conclusion and culmination of my journey. No, my transformation. Perhaps the words aren't meaningful, but my progress has been. During my first clumsy journeys through the shell and into the real park, I felt like I was coming to understand it, becoming an expert, a native of this place. The danger in any cursory familiarity is that a person knows a certain amount, say 8 units of knowledge, and so they might guess that the subject is 10 or 12 units in volume. Surely I knew most of what there was to know. Surely I was an authority, a master. It's only through more exploration, more experimentation, more science, really, that it can be discovered that only the surface has been scratched. This is the trap I thought I was wise enough to avoid, which I suppose is precisely why I wasn't. But recently the world around me, or rather my understanding of it, has grown by astonishing factors. Eratosthenes calculated the size of the planet. Copernicus deduced the layout of the solar system. Hubble blew down the galactic walls of our knowledge, and each time the universe was almost unimaginably more grand than we could have guessed. I don't have the genius they had, but I believe I finally understand what it feels like to build enough knowledge to make everything that came before seem small. To think, a simple survey of a little suburban park would bring me to this new world. To think of it as my own, and lately, to discover it is not. Navigating the roots of the ring had always been difficult. No, not difficult, but I would carry out the decision to turn back before crossing the ring itself. The decision wasn't mine, but I honored it, until, that is, I understood whose decision it was. My home is alive, just like me, and not simply in the sense that the plants and animals are alive. There's a mind, a life made of power and growth, complete with messages, messengers, allies, subjects, and captors. When I sleep, I often overhear the messages. They're shaped such that I cannot know them, but when I awake, I can remember their moods, their taste. My home, I learned, has ambition, a plan, greed, wrath, curiosity. After dreaming, and sometimes while awake, I have moments of connection, glimpses. I've grown to think of the life force not as the place itself, but as someone. Someone with dominion over Hidden Oaks. It is where I belong, but I was not invited. I had learned how to navigate, but there is authority beyond my own. How is it that I could be trespassing when I've never felt more at home? The last time I made my way up the roots, I became aware of the decision to turn back, to not cross the ring. But something had changed. I knew whose decision it was, and I pressed ahead anyway. That's when everything stopped. I was plucked up out of waking and received a message. From her. It was far too much, far too fast. But I was already unconscious and had nowhere else to pass out into. She made herself known. She was not well pleased that I had been living here. Her plans did not include playing host to my kind, whatever that meant. It was time for the two of us to meet, and come to an arrangement. This day she would allow crossing of the ring, and I could have my audience with her. When I awoke, everything felt possible. Everything I comprehended about my home connected to me at once. I could sense my own thoughts outside myself, but they weren't my own, somehow. It was as though my thoughts had been borrowed and transcribed or traced. My fingers remembered something, pencil and paper. I identified the thoughts, the wayward replicas. My survey! The others! Someone had seen my survey, truly seen it. My own cognition crawled around inside another mind. How had that happened? It didn't matter. I had a meeting to get to. The route was familiar, but it felt entirely new. My feet could taste new flavor on the ground. My hair and skin heard new songs in the breeze. Only the visual appearance felt diminished. Dull clouds and gray branches strained out the sunlight and drank up the color, but I didn't need them. Vision was still helpful, like Newtonian physics, but the rest of my senses were wrapping their minds around Einstein. Crossing the ring was no different than any of my prior footsteps. She was near and strong. As I made my way closer, the nature of my footsteps metamorphosed into a more generalized, vague impression of moving forward. My sense of smell recited complex poetry. My hearing licked over mesmerizing designs. Another small measure ahead, and I was there, face to face, with her. My senses were delighted, overwhelmed even, save for my sight. Haze or dizziness or some kind of incompatibility between her appearance and my retinas left me with only a vague portrayal of what she looks like. A cold smoke hung in place like a hooded cloak. Something within the hood occasionally glimmered and gave an impression not unlike a large compass. Swimming within the entire vapor-cloaked figure were both shadow and light. There were definitely limbs the way a person has limbs. One arm and one leg were very different, made less of light and shadow and more of something more grotesque, something unpleasant to look on. In truth, the entire spectral vision was unnerving. At the center, however, was the most curious little detail. No, it was no detail at all, being completely concealed, but it reminded me somehow of spotting a "You are here" marker on a map in a mall. Before I could think to say anything, I felt my borrowed thoughts again. 4. There were 4 minds carrying an echo of my survey, and they were distant. No, they were near. For a moment I thought perhaps there were no such minds at all, that she was attempting to communicate with me. That moment was short-lived, as just then she began to speak. "I do not suffer you to share my home." Our meeting wasn't off to a promising start. Worse still, I was distracted by the 4 others. I could sense them moving toward us, with their bootlegs of my knowledge. "Why do you stay?" she asked me directly. I tried to explain that this was my home too, that as I had come to know and understand it, it had become a part of me. I got the notion that it was her I had been finding my way around inside, an awkward thing to ponder. Worse, the 4 were becoming most distracting. I sensed them getting nearer. An overwhelming surge of connection washed over me. No, us. The 4 had walked through cobwebs, which may as well have been nerves in the appendages of the hooded figure before me. In that instant, she was aware of them too. They began to fade. She must have decided that they were to turn away. A neighborly gesture, I dared to hope. My distractions gone, I was able to focus better on the situation in front of me. I began to see her in a less abstract fashion, but suddenly, a new distraction barged through my mind. Memories of visions. Nightmares. No, dreams, but with some disturbing imagery. Her voice pierced its way to my wandering attention. "You have it, there in your mind. You see it. You name it. Underbridge. It appears to you." The underbridge? Well, of course I could see it. It was one of the main features of my home. That's what I needed to say, but She continued before I could. You see what others do not. You know what it is for, don't you? What it was for? I never saw that it was for anything at all, unless I sometimes see the underbridge fall, I replied. She paused. I could almost sense something that felt like surprise, or perhaps curiosity. Fall? She slowly spoke. Indeed. You see the fall. It was one of the more haunting visions, and I had been seeing it more often lately. Was this important to her? Was it news to her? Could some arrangement be made after all? Oh, my friend, she said, to my surprise. We have here the occasion to quell two problems at once. She had found her way around inside me, too, it seemed. The cost to you will be your sight. The cost to me will be to share my home with you. The cost to make witness of our exchange will be in small lives, disloyal insects. Her strange arm extended, its clutched fist slowly opening. Precisely one handful of crushed earwigs fell from her hand, smashed into contortions not possible for living bugs, a few still twitching as they landed on the soil between us. My sight did seem a rather heavy burden, something I would be glad to be rid of. I began to wonder if this entire exchange formality of hers was just a roundabout expression of what we each wanted already. I wanted the visions to end. Perhaps she was lonely and in fact desired that I stay. I was about to think over any downsides, consider any reasons it might not be a wise agreement, but the decision was already being carried out. Pain receptors and nerves which had never had a thing to report to me in my entire life awoke and screamed their electrochemical screams. The world felt bright, too bright. A halo burned around everything. I could no longer blink. My eyes were out in front of my eyelids. The rings of searing brightness surrounding me were, in truth, my eyelids clamping down on my optic nerves. There were words. Was it a German word, a French phrase, something about the pain that takes your mind off other pain? Those words were memories. I couldn't reach them. My eyelid muscles relaxed and the halos diminished. Then there were more words, words from others, words from the four, no, the three. Contact! Contact! Our exchange was being disturbed. Oh God, what the hell? She would not suffer such interruption. Wrath flashed like lightning and fear cracked like thunder all around. HQ confirmed, cartographer is... The words stopped, and other noises began. Choking, gasping, breathless noises. I could see the operatives. As my eyes twisted, I could see myself seeing them. I could see the cobwebs. Yes. Each of the suited people were still netted in a sparse patchwork of threads. Crisp, thin white lines were attached to their arms, their heads, their legs, not unlike strings on marionettes. The webs pulled tight. The three operatives were yanked a meter off the ground, and the noises turned from gasping and gurgling to sickening cracks and buckling as the limbs and jaws and spines and necks all snapped, crumpled and smashed into contortions not possible for living bodies. At that moment my eyes were no longer mine, and so I saw no more. The snapping and crunching sounds continued only seconds longer. I expected to hear broken bodies hit the ground, but am not sure whether I ever did. Fresh waves of pain from another new location at the center of my skull were robbing me of my wits. I still knew where her form was, looking back at me, using her hand-me-down eyes. I have my sight. You have your home. The small lives are spent. Our exchange is ended. She was right, and she was wrong. She was also leaving, sinking, burrowing somehow. I was alone, and then again, just as quickly, I wasn't. Footsteps were approaching, hurried and uneven. The fourth. You're... Holy shit! It's you, isn't it? You're the surveyor, a voice said, panting. I was. He was right. And you are an operative who chased me, I was ready to say. When had that been? He was different now. He wasn't wearing his secret agent sunglasses, or if he was, they weren't wearing him in return. Wearing. There was something familiar on him. But before I could figure all that out, he spoke again. Where are the others? He was still catching his breath. So much breathing, this one. The others? Did he mean people, like I had been once? I couldn't sense any, apart from him, anywhere in my home. I realized he meant the other operatives. I saw them. They were dying, I said. Why did I bother to help this man? He had only ever been a nuisance to me, to my home, to her. He was alarmed. He was upset, surprised. I couldn't remember ever understanding how the others felt. This was all very disorienting. He was full of doubt. I could see it. You saw them? He challenged. I was so overwhelmed by seeing his feelings, I nearly missed his meaning. He was right again. I didn't have my eyes. My face must have looked quite odd. How could I have seen operatives die without eyes? What happened? Where are they? He asked again. I pointed. There, and right where he was. Rustling. He was looking around. There was a spark of hope in him. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was lying. Maybe I was mad. But then he found what he'd been wishing not to find. His heart sank. The spark gutted out, replaced by... And there it was again. I wanted to help him. He was lost. He wasn't part of this. It wasn't too late for him to leave and be forgotten. But those were my own thoughts. I couldn't judge whether my new landlord would agree. You can't stay here, I said, struggling to help him leave. I was as much shooing him away as drawing the edge of my home near. The operative was disoriented and frightened, shocked and sorry. Was it sorrow? Was he remorseful? Such a mild past surely didn't have need of so much regret. I dropped him just beyond the outermost trees. You can't stay here, and I can't stay. I desperately wanted to finish speaking. I had more to say. I had a message, a thought to complete. I fell. The air was different out at the edge. I felt exposed somehow. Come with me, we have doctors, he offered. So there were more of them. I realized I had never troubled to think over their numbers or anything about them for that matter, but there was something they needed to know. The words spilled out of me like blood. They were mine, but I couldn't govern them. She's growing. She can see you. She does see you. What do you mean? The amateur operative asked. I had just said what I meant. The question was misshapen. I didn't have an answer, so I didn't give one. Instead, I returned home, pushing my way back through the shell. It was unusually rough and unexpectedly draining. And maybe I had weakened. I was on hands and knees. Had I fallen? Why were my own thoughts so slippery? I paused. And maybe I needed rest. I knew I was home. I knew I was finally welcome. I knew the ring was closed, but not to me. I knew I was dizzy, and I knew the taste of blood. I knew today would be significant. The sun was setting. It was August, so it had already set around 8:30, and it was pretty dark by 9. Patrick had picked up the last few hours of Stephanie's evening shift at the Sunex Gas and Go. She was going on a date with her boyfriend. They were going to go see The Sixth Sense, that new Bruce Willis movie about ghosts that came out last Friday. Patrick thought he would like to see it too, but he definitely preferred monsters, aliens, and magic to ghosts and the paranormal. He had taken a few minutes while the traffic was light to go out to the gas pumps and empty the trash bins. He'd seen that they were overflowing when he started his shift. It wasn't just a night shift job to make sure these were emptied out. Anytime they were full, they were supposed to be emptied and new bags put in, but it seemed like the day shift was always putting the task off, leaving it to him. It bothered him for multiple reasons. Not only because he disliked when people didn't do their jobs and pushed work off on others, but because of his paranoia as well. Paper bags and trash was just more kindling for some stray spark to catch alight right around all that highly combustible fuel. As always, his prospect horrified Patrick. He placed a new bag in the bin on the south side of the two pumps, replaced the lid on the container, then tied off the bag he had just removed. He stood up and looked around. The evening was strangely silent. He looked up and down the street that ran in front of the station. No one was in sight. No cars, no pedestrians, not even any birds. He walked over to the other garbage can, lugging the large, heavy bag along with him. He stopped, set down his burden, and then turned around to look up and down the street a second time. Still silence. Still no one. He removed the lid from the container and bent down to set it alongside. Then suddenly, from directly behind him came a loud that whizzed past. Patrick stood up quickly, banged his head on the windshield squeegee holder, and cried out, "Ouch!" He stepped back, stood fully upright, and turned around to see who had startled him. That fucking jogger again," he said to himself, and then louder at the man running as he turned the corner. "Hey! You could stop jogging if it's so terrible." Jeez. His heart was beating fast, and he had to take a deep breath to get his wits about him again. Though he loved scary stories and movies, he really didn't do well with being startled in real life. It always took him a minute to calm himself afterward, and it made him grumpy. He gave a sigh and then returned to his task, pulling out the overflowing bag and trying to crush down the trash inside as much as possible. He picked up the few bottles and other rubbish that was scattered around the base of the bin. This he stuffed inside the bag and then tied it closed. He took these 2 bags over to the large rolling cart that he had brought out here with him. In it were other full garbage bags from outside the front of the store, as well as the receptacles inside, one by the soda fountain, one by the exit, one in each bathroom, and one behind the counter. They were all full. It seemed like nobody else cared about cleanliness, or work, or anything sometimes. He shrugged it off. All he could control was himself. He heaved the 2 large bags from the gas pump trash containers into the cart and started to push it out to the back of the store where the dumpster was located. Behind the store was a narrow dirt alley that separated the store from a small strip of woods, beyond which were residential homes. The alley was so narrow that a garbage truck couldn't fit back here to pick up the trash from the dumpster. They always had to push it out onto the side of the store on garbage day. Patrick didn't know why Mr. Schaefer wouldn't just let them leave it out there. It was more open, and he could see if customers were coming in too. The little strip of woods was really quite thin. In the fall, winter, and spring, you could see the houses through the trees, but in summer, the buckthorn undergrowth was so thick that you could only see leaves and patches of shadow. He didn't like being out here at night, and not even now, in the beginnings of evening twilight. The monsters in his head sometimes came alive around him. And this was always something that troubled his mind when he was alone at night. So when he was back here, he usually worked quickly. He heaved open the dumpster lid and rested it up against the wall of the store. He began tossing bags out of his cart and into it. He would grab one, turn, take a few steps, and throw it the rest of the way. On the 3rd bag, he had just begun to thrust it in his throwing arc when his shins suddenly struck something and he stumbled a few steps. His follow-through continued and he released the bag, which hit the side of the dumpster and broke open on the ground. He caught himself before face-planting into the dirt. "Shit," said Patrick. Reaching down to rub his shin, he looked around at the ground and didn't see anything that he might have tripped on. Whatever it was, he'd hit it hard. There was a sharp, cold pain that ran across his right shin. He knew it would bruise tomorrow. He threw the last few bags into the dumpster without incident, and then walked over to pick up the rogue mist bag that had broken open. It hadn't spilled much. He picked everything up, tossed it into the dumpster, and closed the lid. When he turned around to walk back to his cart, he tripped again. He fell forward and landed hard on his knees, arresting the rest of the forward movement with his outstretched hands. "What the fuck? I can't even walk tonight," he said, frustrated. When he tripped this time, he had heard a strange rattling noise. and he swore that when his knees hit the ground, he heard a low laugh coming from the trees. When he looked into them, it felt for a second like he saw a pair of eyes above what looked like a wide, toothy grin that made him think of Animal from the Muppets. He closed his eyes and shook his head, and when he opened them, all he saw were trees, the shadows in the alley, all as they were supposed to be. I have got to keep the monsters in my head. I'm starting to see the Unnamed in New Brighton. All right, keep the fiction out of the real world, Patrick, he said to calm himself. The Unnamed was what he had started calling the shadowy monsters that he'd written into his apocalyptic version of Minnesota in the story he was currently working on. They were like golden skeletons wrapped in cloaks made of shadow and had claws like the scythe of the Grim Reaper. They were terrifying, and he loved them. He had a special place in his heart for the monsters he put down on the page, but he did not like it when they started creeping up on him in the real world. He heard the bell on the front door jingle. A customer must have entered the store. He needed to get back in there anyway. There was only one person that covered the evening and night shifts. He opened the back door of the store and pushed the cart in front of him. He rinsed and dried his hands quickly at the storeroom sink and then walked out behind the counter. There was a short Hispanic woman with a young boy, probably 10 or 11, perusing the snack aisle. These two came into the store often. Gloria was the woman's name, and her nephew was Ben. Patrick really liked them. Gloria was beautiful and very kind. She was a paramedic, and she watched her sister's son once a week so her sister could go on a date night with her husband. She was always so nice to Ben, and to Patrick. He knew she must be incredible at her job. She had a nature that exuded caring and calmness. Ben was always excited to tell Patrick about a new video game or comic book. After they had picked out tonight's snacks, they walked up to the counter and set their purchases down for Patrick to ring up. "Hey, Gloria. Hey, Benno. How's it going today, bud?" said Patrick in an even more friendly tone than he usually used. "Hello, Patrick," said Gloria. "Hey, Patrick, guess what?" replied Ben. "I don't know, you're going to kick your aunt's butt at Street Fighter again tonight?" "No, we finally got Super Smash Brothers, and I'm going to kick her butt at that instead," said the kid, pumping his fists in the air. "Nice," said Patrick. "Oh, is that so?" asked Gloria as she tousled the boy's hair. "You aren't even going to give me a chance, huh?" "I already know I'm going to blast you into the ground with Samus's cannon," he said as he pretended to fire photon blasts out of the end of his arm at her. Patrick finished ringing them up and chuckled at Ben's remarks. "That's 617, please. I'm jealous you guys get to have all that fun while I'm stuck here at work. Hey, I'll tell you all about the monsters I'm working on in my stories next time you stop by, okay?" "Yeah, I can't wait. See you later, Patrick," said Ben. He turned and quickly walked out of the door, just as a man was opening it. The man hopped his feet back so the kid could run under his arm as he held the door open. "Ben!" "Sorry, sir," said Gloria as she ducked under the man's arm as well and hurried off after her nephew. The man gazed after the two of them, still holding the door open for a few seconds before entering the store. He looked up at Patrick and gave a slight nod in greeting before heading into the first aisle. He was one of the sunglasses-wearing, besuited men from the black cars. This wasn't the first time one of them had stopped into the store, but it didn't happen very often. They usually just lurked around out front, being weird in their cars. A thought crossed his mind as he looked out at the black car parked a few spots down from the front door. He had never seen one of them fill up with gas. Patrick startled. He had been lost in thought looking outside. The black suit guy was standing on the other side of the counter. His face was blank and his sunglasses were directed toward Patrick. He couldn't know, however, if the man was staring at him or not. On the counter between them was the smallest bag of charcoal the store carried and 11 bottles of charcoal lighter fluid. Without turning his head, the man reached over and grabbed a yellow lighter off the display and stood it up to the right of the bottles on the counter. 11 bottles! Exclaimed Patrick. "That's all I have in stock, and it's grilling season, man. You've got more lighter fluid than charcoal." The suit guy just shrugged, said nothing, and waited for Patrick to ring up and bag the items. He pushed the clerk exact change across the counter, grabbed his bags, and left the store. Patrick watched him get into his car and drive away. This was the first time he had seen one of these guys in his car alone. There were almost always at least two of them together. Why did everything around him seem to scream fire hazard? He shook the thought away. He was trying to work on quelling his irrational fears more often lately. Being this worried in life certainly couldn't be good for him. And this evening was busy. There usually weren't this many people coming in on his shift, but he had to remind himself he usually wasn't working until 11 o'clock p.m. It was too early for him to take a break and start writing, especially with people coming in left and right. However, there did seem to be a bit of a lull, and he could at least snack at the counter between customers for now. Snacks always helped distract his mind from worries and helped him to focus on his creative side. He popped a bag of popcorn he had brought from home and put it in a big plastic bowl. It was the kind of bowl that everyone remembered having as a kid. And it was always only used for one of two things: putting popcorn into or puking in at the side of the bed. He walked out into the store next to the soda fountain, mixed his favorite slushy flavor, and slathered the popcorn in the bowl with enough nacho cheese to nearly fill it halfway. He grabbed a fork, walked back over to the counter, and sat down on his stool, his bowl of notch corn, as he called it, in his lap. He was devouring forkfuls of nacho cheese-covered popcorn between sips of his slushie as he daydreamed about his monsters when the bell on the front door jingled. Patrick watched as two kids he had seen before but didn't know by name came into the store. They didn't acknowledge him. They just continued their conversation and walked back to the wall of refrigerators. So the clerk just kept eating his snack and watching them as they shopped. "Hey, do you still want to try and see Mystery Men next week?" one boy asked the other. "I don't know. I've been hearing it really isn't that good," said the other, as the first boy pulled a 2-liter bottle of Mountain Dew off the bottom shelf of one of the refrigerators. They walked to the candy aisle. One of the kids picked up 2 Mamba fruit chews and a roll of Spree candies. "Aren't you getting anything?" he asked. "I don't know, Will. The movies were more expensive than what we were thinking. I thought they were going to be 2 rentals for 49 cents, and it ended up being over $6 for 2. "That's just on Tuesdays. Today's Monday," shouted Will. "Darius, if you want something, I can grab it for you." "You sure?" Darius asked. Will nodded. "All right, I'll get you back next time." He picked out a king-size Hershey's cookies and cream bar, and the two of them walked up to the counter to check out. They looked up at Patrick, who had just stuffed his mouth with another forkful of liquid cheese-covered popcorn before ringing up their items. A large gob of cheese clung to the front of his chin. "Hey, you got cheese on your chin," said Will. "Oh, thanks," said Patrick, wiping it away with a napkin. That comes to $4.41. Will handed over a $5 bill and took his change. He and Darius walked toward the front door. "I can't believe your mom left us again. Do you think anyone else has problems like me? I mean, we spend half our time walking back home from..." The boys froze, staring out the door they had just opened. The orange, fiery light on their faces sent a sinking panic through Patrick. "Oh God, it's happening," he thought, leaning forward to gaze out and see what the boys were seeing. He caught only a glimpse of a fiercely bright streak of flame, much smaller than he'd imagined, scorching quickly across the sky. It was up, away, and out of sight just as suddenly as it had appeared. The boys left the store, one of them saying something about the solar eclipse that was supposed to be happening this Wednesday, and Patrick returned to his stool. With his heart still pumping, he let out a small chuckle. What was life, anyway, if not a series of weird and unsettling things happening? In the meantime, he might as well enjoy some more cheese. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Hidden Oaks. Stay tuned for some special messages after the credits. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story The Cage, written by Patrick W. Marsh. Exchange by Owen Swerkstrom. And Sunex Sunset by Robert Dawn. The voice of Hidden Oaks and Eddie performed by Robert Dawn. The voice of Ellie, performed by Robin Sand. The voice of the father, performed by Owen Swerkstrom. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at hiddenoakspod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. In a few weeks, we will be recording a Q&A session. So if you have any questions about the story or the production of the show, reach out to us through our social media or email us through the website. Thanks again for listening to Season 1. And on behalf of myself, Patrick, and Owen, another special thank you to David Schwartz, Robin Sand, and Chris Gildy for all your amazing creative work and helping us bring the story and the characters of this podcast to life. Stay tuned for a behind-the-scenes special coming out in 2 weeks. Also, just so you know, our friends over at Trick Apparel are working on some awesome merch for the show. We'll let you know when it's available. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening. And until next time.